speaking of secrets, the secret to happiness, would you like to know what it is? Low expectations. And here's why. So I'll give you an example. Mr. Ellis walked in this morning and he says, you got a really high bar to meet because your wife is awesome, and I'm paraphrasing. And I said, yeah. Now I know that he's going to be disappointed in me because he has high expectations. Think about it. Well, last time you went to a movie, if you walked in and you thought, this movie's going to kind of suck, and then it was okay, you're like happy, right? But if you walked in, like anytime you go to watch what it's called, the sequel to a good movie, what always happens? It sucks. Yeah, any of the even-numbered movies suck. And then you're disappointed. You're no longer happy. So the secret to happiness, and by the way, also long marriage, is low expectations. So let's get started here. In case you don't understand where we're at, this is a corporate finance class. And corporate finance and financial management and managerial finance are all exactly the same thing. Sorry, we have many different names for the same thing in finance, and then sometimes we use the same word to describe different concepts. I didn't invent this stuff, and you have my apologies. So let's talk about the balance sheet model of the firm. Remember, you guys were supposed to have had at least 6 hours of accounting in here. We've got assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. That's the balance sheet. What are assets? Well, assets are things that we expect to provide economic benefit for the firm going forward. So things the firm owns that are going to provide economic benefit for the firm going forward. For instance, you have a food truck, and the food truck would be an asset, and the kitchen equipment inside the truck would be an asset, and your inventory would be an asset. Those are all things you're expecting to bring you economic benefit in the future. And then we have liabilities. And liabilities is just simply money that you owe. And we typically think about this as money that you've borrowed, but there are other ways to have liabilities. For instance, if you owe taxes, or if you get sued and lose, you have liabilities. And then finally we have equity. Equity is the ownership stake. Basically, if you took the assets, sold them, and paid off all of the liability, what's left over is the equity. Now, if we're talking about corporations, then we would refer to that as the stock of the firm. Oh, for shame, he's late, Mr. Warren. And you were early last time. He's making up for it. Okay. Now, any question? This is very basic stuff, right? If your mind is blown, we've got a problem. Now let's talk about, and the reason we talk about that is because we're going to talk about now the 3 big questions of corporate finance. And these don't change with time. They are always the 3 big questions we ask. Number 1, what long-term assets should be purchased by the firm? Remember, we said that assets are things we expect to produce benefit going into the future. Long-term in finance and accounting is how long?
For a year.
Yeah, more than a year. Well, that doesn't sound very long-term, does it? But it's more than a year. Okay, so if we're talking about what we're going to buy, so should we build a new factory? Amazon recently built a new distribution center here. That is a capital budgeting decision. That's an asset that they decided to build. You can also buy assets. Okay, so that's the capital budgeting question. And then we have, now that we know what we're going to buy or build, we have to figure out where to get the money. So how do we finance the assets that we're going to purchase? And typically we're talking about debt or equity. Debt or equity. Now the debt is money, obviously, that we're going outside to raise. We're borrowing money. And the equity can come from one of 2 places. Either we could go out and issue new stock to raise additional equity, or we have the addition to the accumulated retained earnings of the firm. That is called internally generated equity. So we've got to figure out how we're going to finance these assets using debt and equity. And we refer to that as the capital structure question. The capital structure question. The definition of capital structure, are you ready? It's the mix of debt and equity used to finance the assets of the firm. The capital structure is merely the mix of debt and assets used to finance the assets, debt and equity used to finance the assets of the firm. And then we have question number 3. And by comparison, question number 3 does not appear to be that sexy. So what is question number 3? How should we manage the short-term operating cash flows of the firm? What's short-term in finance and accounting? Yeah, less than a year. We call this the working capital management question. Do you guys remember what net working capital is? What's the formula? Go ahead.
The current asset deduct the current liability.
Very good. Current assets minus current liabilities. What are current assets? They're things we expect to provide cash within 1 year. What are current liabilities? Things we expect to consume cash within the next year. And so the difference between those two we call the net working capital. Here we're talking about managing all of our working capital. Now, how do I remember the names of these 3 questions? Well, they all have the word capital in them. Capital budgeting, capital structure, and working capital management. So these are the 3 big ones, and we're going to be talking about how to do each one of these as we go through this class. Any questions so far? Okay, now, by the way, chapter 1 is what I would call potpourri. It's got a little bit of everything in it. Everything that isn't somewhere else is stuffed into chapter 1, so there's going to be some abrupt transitions, so I'm sorry about that. Let's talk about where financial managers fall in the organization. And first of all, let's talk about, this is driving me crazy, it's not quite level. I told you I'm slightly autistic, right? There we go. Okay, so organizations, we're talking corporations. Corporations have boards of directors. Who elects the boards of directors? Shareholders, right? The shareholders do. And in fact, this is how shareholders exercise their decision-making power at the firm as owners. By the way, equity holders get to make the decisions through the board of directors. And then the board of directors has 3 primary jobs: hire, compensate, and fire managers. Hire, compensate, and fire managers. And in truth, they're typically just hiring the CEO, and then they will let her or him choose their own team. Now, we'll talk about why that is here in a little bit. But I want you to notice something in that second circle there that says chairman of the board and chief executive officer. I want you to scratch through chairman of the board. I want you to scratch right through that, because those don't have to be the same person. And in fact, we're going to talk about how it's actually stupid to have them be the same person, because you end up having what we would call the fox watching the hen house situation, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. Okay, so the top manager at the firm is the chief executive officer. The chief executive officer is the visionary, the one looking out there, thinking long-term and thinking strategically. And then there is the person directly beneath them called the chief operating officer, chief operations officer. Boy, that's hard to say. This person is responsible for executing. So the CEO is making the vision, the COO is responsible for executing that vision. At my house, my wife is the visionary one. She's the one that figured out that we could be professors. My job as the chief operating officer was to make that happen, right? So that's, you could think of companies like that. The CEO is the one that's out there looking at and figuring out what are the possibilities. The COO makes things happen. Now, reporting to the COO is the very highest ranking finance type person at the firm. That is the chief financial officer. The chief financial officer. And we'll go ahead and look beneath the chief financial officer and see that basically they get broken into 2 groups of people here. One of these groups is finance oriented, and that would be the group on the left under the treasurer. And one of these groups is accounting oriented, and that would be over on the right under controller. So the treasurer is the top pure finance person at the firm. The treasurer is the top pure finance person at the firm, and they typically have 4 direct reports. The first would be the cash manager. Out of our 3 questions we said for corporate finance, which of those 3 questions do you think the cash manager is responsible for? Yeah, number 3. And in fact, they also work with the credit manager on question number 3. By the way, do we really want to extend credit to customers? Do you like loaning money to people? I don't. Why do we do it? Oh, well, a lot of the stuff that we sell, we're giving them 30 days, same as cash. So interest isn't the answer. Why do car lots offer financing?
Immediate cash.
To sell cars, right? This is to sell cars. And so that's what people offer credit to get sales, right? But we've got to figure out who are we willing to extend credit to, and that's what the credit manager does. Then we have our capital expenditures group. They're the group that's deciding what projects to undertake. Which of the 3 questions would that be?
1.
Yeah, it's going to be the first one, a capital budgeting question. And then we have financial planning. And in fact, we're going to talk about long-term financial planning in chapter 3, and it's all about figuring out how we are going to finance the things that the capital expenditures group is coming up with. So which question is that?
2.
Yes, it's number 2. Okay, so that's on the finance side of the house. Over here on the accounting side of the house, we have the controller, which is actually the top accountant at the firm. And in fact, the word is spelled like this. And Americans will pronounce this how? Comptroller, right? Apparently, though, in French, when you pronounce this word, which is French, it's controller. Why do we do this to ourselves? I have no idea. Is the controller in charge of the firm? Is the controller controlling the firm? No. Just think of the controller as the top accountant at the firm. Now let's talk about who is under the controller. First of all, we have the tax manager. What do you think the tax manager is responsible for doing? What's their big goal in life?
Pay less taxes.
Pay less taxes. Now, there are lots of ways to pay less taxes. In specific, we are looking for what kind of ways to reduce our taxes? Legal ones, right? Well, legal ones. We want legal ways to reduce our taxes, and that's what the tax manager is all about. Now, you've got to be careful with tax managers because they can be aggressive, which, by the way, if you hear of someone doing aggressive accounting or aggressive tax stuff, stay away, because those people are most likely going to prison. You don't want to be with them. And then we have our cost accounting manager. Now, at first, you say, well, wait a minute, it must be pretty easy to figure out the cost. I mean, we know we paid $10 for this thing, right? Whoop! Easy, easy, easy. But there is a lot more to it than that. For example, the electric bill for this building. How would we apportion that out to the service that we're providing to you? You have to have some fancy cost accountant to figure that out. That's beyond me. So we often have these overheads that have to be allocated, and that's where your cost accounting manager comes in. And then we have the financial accounting manager. The financial accounting manager is responsible for producing the financial statements of the firm. The financial accounting manager is responsible for producing the financial statements of the firm. Now, the financial statements of the firm, you say, oh, they just got to put out a report once every 3 months. Here's the deal. In a publicly traded corporation, who do we send those reports to? Shareholders, that's number 1, and who else? The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, When we send those in under something called Sarbanes-Oxley, we have to sign saying that they are correct under penalty of jail, right? And so you might think, oh, all they got to do is submit 4 reports a year. It's an easy job. Wrong. It's under penalty of going to prison, right? And so that's not an easy job. And then, strangely enough, we have the Information Systems Manager. This is an old way of organizing. It's an old way of organizing. So let's talk about how the computer folks ended up on the accounting side of the house. In the beginning, long, long ago, I'll tell you a true story here. My mom, 1964, she is the bookkeeper at a limestone quarry in my hometown of Carthage, Missouri. And they have this computer. It's like the first computer maybe in Missouri, but definitely in my hometown. It took up an entire room, but all they were using it for was billing. By the way, billing is accounts receivable, which would be under accounting, right? You know, it's related. Okay, well then they figured out, wait a minute, not only can we use this for sending out these bills, we can also use it to track all the transactions at the company. And so now it becomes like their transaction journal, right? And then someone figured out, hey, wait a minute, we can actually pull that information together to come up with our first draft for the balance sheet and the income statement and all that sort of stuff. So in the beginning, when you saw computers in a company, typically they were involved in accounting type activities. And so if you see them in an accounting portion of the firm, know that's just a historical leftover from the time when basically the accountants were the only ones with computers. By the way, today we have CFO. Most likely you'll find the computers under who? CIO, the Chief Information Officer, usually someone that is on the same reporting level as the CFO. Questions? Yeah?
Whenever you start to see some of these positions get lumped into like one person, how is that kind of made?
Okay, so a lot of times at smaller organizations, you'll actually see all this stuff lumped. So for instance, I worked for a place that was a small family-owned business. And the treasurer, cash manager, credit manager were all the same person. And then we in engineering were taking care of the capital expenditures portion of it. And then he was also taking care of the financial planning portion of it. And so, yeah, you can kind of glom these together. But when you get into publicly traded corporations, typically they're divided out. Good question. Other questions? Okay, now we're making another jump. I want to talk about a legal concept. The legal concept is limited versus unlimited liability. And if the equity investors are responsible for all the debts of the firm, then we say they have unlimited liability. If they are only responsible up to the amount that they have invested in the firm, then we say they have limited liability. So how would you find yourself in a world of hurt with unlimited liability? Let's say that you and a friend decide to open up a business, and that business is making pesticide. And you guys make this really great pesticide, and everybody loves your pesticide, and it's selling well. But then, and you guys have probably $1 million in assets, other than your pesticide factory. Then, they figure out that your pesticide is actually causing leukemia, and you get sued. Now, the decision against you is going to run into the billions. You say, well, I guess we lose the business. Oh no, friends, you're on the hook for far more than that if you have unlimited liability. You're on the hook all the way into the billions. And so I'm going to give you a poignant example here about unlimited liability. When I lived in Mississippi, I had a guy mow my yard. His name was Mark, and he was mowing my yard one day. And by the way, how do people get into the lawn mowing business? Do they go to business school? No, my guy has, by the way. He's one of my former MBA graduates. He runs a business here in town. But typically the guy that comes to mow your yard is someone that has a truck and a lawnmower and a trailer and maybe a dream, who knows, right? But so this guy is coming and he comes to mow my yard. And he's mowing my yard, and my neighbors next door, the mom opens the door to come outside, and their dog, Fluffy, whoop, runs right past her. And so she's like chasing Fluffy out into the yard, and the kids follow, 3 kids, follow out into the yard. And the dog actually gets away, gets over into my yard, and runs under the deck of the lawnmower. Blood and fur everywhere. Now, that's tragedy. Mark knows something's going on. And then he sees the blood and the fur, and he sees the mom with a look of horror on her face, and the kids, right? Really, really bad. Now, is it going to be enough that Mark says, "I'm sorry"? No. Now, something else I need to tell you about Fluffy. Fluffy's actual name was Sir Charles Fluffmeister IV. He was a champion show dog. He's been put out to stud, which, by the way, is good work if you can get it. But he is worth $50,000 market value. So, is it going to be enough that Mark pays $50,000 to replace the economic value of the dog? No, this is America, baby. By the way, Mississippi is what's known as a judicial hellhole, which is why a lot of like the tobacco lawsuits and all that stuff get transferred to Mississippi, because it's the best judgment, best justice money can buy. Right? So you can buy off judges, you can buy off juries. It's kind of, it's bad. Okay, now, so Mark gets sued, and Mark goes to court. And the lawyer for the dog says, "Ladies and gentlemen," by the way, this is what people sound like in Mississippi. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, certainly you can agree that this dog was no mere dog. This dog was a member of the family." And by the way, everyone in Mississippi loves dogs, right? So, "This dog was a member of the family. I'm asking you, members of the jury, to award my client $2 million. As a hush falls over the courtroom, the jury goes out. The jury comes back. Sure enough, they're recommending $2 million in damages. And the judge, which strangely sounds just like the lawyer, says, "Why, that's ridiculous. I'm only going to make you pay $1 million. Now, Mark goes home to his wife. She says, "How was court?" He says, "We lost." And she says, "How much?" And he says, $1 million. And his wife says, "Well, I guess you're going to lose your business." He's like, "Oh, no, it's more than that. You see, the lawyer educated me on this because I had unlimited liability. Not only can they come after my pickup truck, my trailer, and my mower, they can also come after our house, your Suburban, the kids' college fund, you name it. They can take it. They can't take your retirement funds, I don't think, but they can take pretty much everything else. So basically, you're going to be wiped out." Now, is that a good situation to be in? No. I'm going to tell you right now that this did not happen. Usually, so I'm sorry, I had, and now you say, "Why in the world would you tell me such a terrible story?" And I actually had a young lady sitting on the front row crying at one point. And I'm like, "Oh, honey, don't do that. It's bullshit," right? Anyway, so why would I do that? Because when you start a business, I want you to remember that you need to do something to get rid of this unlimited liability. You need to do something to get rid of this unlimited liability. And the way we're going to do that is by the choice of the legal form of business that we choose. And you will think, now that I've told you this, and after I tell you how easy it is to do this, you'll say, "Why wouldn't everyone do that?" And the question is, not everyone has had the pleasure of sitting through Finance 780 and hearing about the joys of limited liability, right? Okay. Questions about limited or unlimited liability before we move on? Yeah.
Would this be more like personal small businesses trying to waive that unlimited liability, or would it be like more?
Oh no. So let's talk about someone that could really get into big trouble. General Electric. Let's say General Electric has, and they're a big publicly held company, right? And they're making these electric transformers, and they use this stuff called PCB oil in it, right? Which we know now causes really, really bad stuff. If GE got sued for more than, and lost more than the amount that the whole company was worth equity-wise, that limited liability would protect the shareholders. The most they're ever going to lose is the amount that they have invested in that. So when I was 20-something, I bought some GE stock. Bad idea. But I bought some. Now, I spent, I think it was like $835 to get those shares of GE stock. If something really, really bad goes down with GE today and they get sued for trillions, the most I'm ever going to lose is my $835. And so that's limited liability from the perspective of shareholders. And in fact, this limited liability that we see for corporations is the reason that share price can never be negative. Right? That's the reason share price, can never be negative, because the worst that can happen is that you lose all of your investment. You're not going to lose any more than that. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk about the legal forms of business, and we'll go through here. We've already talked about limited liability. Let's talk about something called double taxation. And we'll talk about corporations first. The way it works at corporations is that corporations earn money. We'll call that their pre-tax income, and then they have to pay corporate tax on that. And then they can take the rest of that money, it belongs to the shareholders, by the way, they can pay it out to the shareholders as a dividend. But when they do, what do the shareholders have to pay as a result of receiving that dividend? More taxes. And so that's why we call it double taxation for corporations. And we're going to see that corporations are the only thing up here that are subject to double taxation. And you'll hear people get all upset about how, oh, dividends are taxed at this relatively low rate. And what these people are missing out on is that that money has already been taxed once. And so this is actually a second tax on it. Okay, so let's talk about, let's start with sole proprietorships. The word sole, what do you think it means? Yeah, just one. A proprietor is an owner. So a sole proprietorship is a one-owner firm. The sole proprietorship does not have limited liability. In other words, it has unlimited liability. This is what got Mark into trouble. But good news for Mark is he was not undergoing double taxation there. All the profits of the sole proprietorship are taxed as regular income to the owner. So just like my university earnings are taxed as regular income, with one difference. The sole proprietor also has to pay this self-employment tax because, I don't know if you guys knew this, your employer is actually paying half of your Social Security stuff. And if you are self-employed, guess what? You think the government lets you off with that half? No, bro, you're paying double. Okay, so, but you're still only being taxed on the profit. There's not a double taxation there, other than that payroll thing. Is it easy to transfer the ownership of a sole proprietorship? At first glance, you might say, oh yeah, all he's got to do is sell his pickup truck, his trailer, and his lawnmower. But is that the true entire value of the firm? See if I can see any examples here. Mr. Gaither, what does your shirt say?
Adidas.
Adidas. Okay, now Adidas owns some, let's assume they own factories. They're probably farming that stuff out to some Vietnamese factory, but let's assume they've got factories. Now, we could add together the value of their factories and their headquarters and all that, And do you think it would come anywhere near what the market values that firm at? No. What else is going on there?
They have like their image.
Yeah, they've got their brand value, right? And in fact, you can look at the identical shoe, and if one of them has the 3 stripes on it, and another one has a picture of a litter box on it, I just chose that at random, but we don't have cats. Which one would have more value to it? Yeah, the Adidas shoe, even though they're otherwise identical. By the way, do you know why it's called, and it's actually Adidas, right? Do you know why it's called Adidas? Adolf Das. Audi was his nickname, so he's Adidas. So it's a guy's name. And here is the even more fun fact. He and his brother started the company, and his brother got pissed off at him and left. What did his brother go to do?
Puma.
Yeah. Isn't that cool? I mean, these 2 brands go way, way back. Okay, long story short, sole proprietorships can be similar. If your business has some brand recognition or an established customer base, there are all sorts of things that would make that thing more valuable than just the value of the assets. So how do we figure out how much this thing is worth? If I were to give you a piece of advice about selling a business, it's don't try to do it on your own. And here's why. Because you have no idea. In fact, the great majority of private business owners have no idea what their firm is truly worth. And this is how Warren Buffett, one of the ways Warren Buffett has gotten rich. He goes around and he buys up these private businesses from people who don't know what their business is really worth, and then it becomes part of his publicly traded company and it gets correctly valued by the market. Okay, now let's say, how are we going to sell this then? What we want to do is go to someone who has an idea of what the business is worth. They're called a business broker. And a business broker, by the way, a broker, like a real estate broker, they're going to sell it and they're going to take a percentage. When you sell real estate in the state of Missouri, what's the percentage?
6%.
Yeah, 6%. Business brokerage, it's 10%. You say, wait a minute, I don't want to give 10%. But here's the deal. Maybe the business broker can get $1 million for your firm, and so you're paying them $100,000 and you've got $900,000 left. But you were only thinking your business was worth $300,000. Were you better off to go with the broker? Absolutely. And so it sounds like it's easy to transfer ownership, but it's not. And by the way, you also have to go find someone that's willing and interested in doing the same business that you are, right? That's relatively rare. When I make investments in stuff, in businesses, it's through shares. Do I have to get involved with the daily operations? Absolutely not. Okay, now moving on to perpetual succession. What does perpetual mean? Yeah, it goes on forever and ever, right? Perpetuity goes on forever and ever. Succession is the idea that basically perpetual succession says that the organization lives forever. And we only have one of them up here that, in theory, has this. But your sole proprietorship, that legal form of business, dies when? Any guesses?
The owner dies.
Yeah, when the owner dies, it's gone, right? Now, can the owner leave the business to his or her children? Of course they can. But the kid that inherits it starts a new sole proprietorship. Is it easy to raise capital for a sole proprietorship? No. Let me tell you a true story this time. This is not BS. A true story. I had a student, this was 2007, 2008, and he wanted to start a landscaping business. And by the way, he's been successful and he's doing quite well. But back then, all he had was a dream, right? And so he goes to the bank to borrow money to get his business started. He already had his pickup truck, he already had his trailer, he just wanted this $10,000 mower, and $10,000 was more money back then. So he goes into the bank, and he goes to see the loan officer, and the loan officer says, "Can I help you?" And my student says, "I have a dream." And the loan officer says, "Great, tell me your dream." He says, "I want to have the top landscaping business in all of Springfield, Missouri." And the banker says, that's a great dream. He says, what do you need to get that dream started? He says, well, I've got the pickup truck, I've got the trailer, I just need this $10,000 lawnmower. And the banker said, okay, how much money do you already have? And my student said, nothing. His wealth was zero at that point, right? Now, what do you think the banker told him? What's that?
Need collateral.
Yeah, he told him, don't let the door hit you on the way out, right? Okay, now, this could have been the end of his story if he were not persistent. What he did is he went down, and this is like a phase of mourning and grieving for him. He goes down to the lawnmower dealership, and he stands in front of the lawnmower he desires with tears streaming down his cheeks. And the salesperson, that part might be BS, and the salesperson comes up to him and says, there, what's wrong? And he says, well, I had a dream, and the dream was to buy this lawnmower and start my own business and become rich someday, but the banker told me he's not going to loan me any money. The salesman says, don't worry. Why is the salesman saying don't worry? Yeah, we're going to finance you right here. Now, why would the dealership finance him when the bank would not? Yeah, so usually the first answer is what Mr. Ellis said, and that is the higher interest rate. But couldn't the bank have charged him more interest? Yeah, they could both do that. But someone else said the magic word starts with an S. Yeah, they're increasing their sales. And by the way, the salesperson gets paid based on commission. And so the salesperson, do you think he's interested in making this sale? Oh yeah. Do you think the salesperson really cares whether the guy can pay back the loan? Hell no. He's going to need his commission one way or another. Remember, people are scumbags. Okay, back to the story. So, it's hard to raise capital. Number one, the equity is limited to the wealth of the individual. The equity is limited to the wealth of the individual. And then the debt is hard to raise. The debt's hard to raise because the bank may not want to loan to you. But here's the best thing about, and also the worst thing about sole proprietorships, it's amazingly easy to start one. It's amazingly easy to start one. And here's how you do it. So we just had a snowstorm. Undoubtedly, we're going to have another one. Undoubtedly, they'll shut down the campus. Undoubtedly, you'll have the day off. And you'll say, I'll bet I could go shovel some sidewalks and make some money. So what do? You go out and you shovel some sidewalks for $40, $100, whatever you're charging. And then you get paid. Voila, you are a sole proprietor and you didn't even know it. And you wouldn't even think about it except for one thing. One of those sidewalks that you shoveled, the stuff melted a little bit, it froze back up, and Mrs. Jones went out and broke her hip. And now she's suing you. And you say, oh, I'm sorry about that. Here's your $40 back. Do you think that's going to fix things? Hell no. Now suddenly you figure out that you are on the hook for the entirety of Mrs. Jones' medical care, plus, pain and suffering. Because you have unlimited liability, because you accidentally became a sole proprietor. Now, I was given this lecture to a group of China EMBA students, and I'm going to tell you how easy it is to get rid of this unlimited liability. And that my students said, certainly no one would be stupid enough to become a sole proprietor. And it was so funny because they came to my office. They like to come to my office and argue. And they would come to my office, and one of my former students comes by, a guy named Nick. And I said, hey, Nick, I haven't seen you in a long time. He comes in, he sits down, and I'm like, what are you doing these days? And keep in mind, these Chinese folks are still there. And he says, I've started a business. I said, really? What are you doing? He says, well, I have a store. I'm like, wow, that's great. What do you sell? He says, well, he was from the Marshall Islands. And he was selling handicrafts from his homeland because apparently there's a large Marshallese community here, and they long to have this sort of stuff that reminds them of home. He was doing really well. I said, okay, let me ask you this. Are you a sole proprietor? And at that moment, his jaw dropped because he realized in his hustle to start the company, he had failed to do the one thing that would have kept him from having unlimited liability. And my Chinese students were, of course, also shocked that someone could be this stupid. Now, is this guy stupid? No, he was excited. He was excited. Now, there are a lot of people who are excited that wouldn't even know to be terrified when I ask if they were a sole proprietor, right? Because they haven't had a class like this. So what we're going to see is that, in fact, this is actually a great test question. The most popular form of business in the United States is the sole proprietorship. The most popular form of business in the United States is the sole proprietorship. And it's simply because, number one, it's so easy to start. And number two, people just don't know any better. And so on the exam, there will be a multiple choice question that says, what's the most popular form of business in the United States? The correct answer will be sole proprietorship. People who weren't paying attention will always choose corporation. Corporation, actually, there are relatively few corporations. Now, they're much bigger and you've heard of them, but there are lots and lots of sole proprietorships. Okay, now let's talk about partnerships. And partnerships are a whole lot like sole proprietorships, except for what? Yeah, there's more than one person, right? There's more than one person. So it could be two or more. My sister was involved in a partnership where there were 4 people. The partnership, a general partnership, that's what we're talking about here. A general partnership, they do not have limited liability. They do not have limited liability. And so the partners are on the hook. Now, let's say Mr. Tips and I go into business together. Mr. Tips, are you independently wealthy?
Yes, sir.
You are?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to move on then. Ms. Hudson, are you independently wealthy? I'm going to ask you why the hell you're here. Okay, so we're moving on. Are you independently wealthy?
No.
No, okay. And just give me a rough estimate of your age.
23.
23, okay. So she's 23, I'm 53. Now, I have been playing this game for a while. I am a wealthy man. I have money to put into this partnership. She does not. But let's say it's a 50-50 partnership. And we get sued. And they want $4 million. In theory, I'm on the hook for 2. She's on the hook for 2. Do you have $2 million?
No.
Hell no! So you're thinking, oh, well, I guess the person that sued is only going to get by with $2 million. What happens, Miss Sego?
They're going to go after you.
They're going to come after me! I'm on the hook for the whole $4 million. What does that tell you about forming a partnership with a person that has a different level of wealth than you? It's a bad idea for the rich partner. It's a great idea for the poor partner, which, by the way, also applies to marriage. Okay. So that's about partnership. So we know that unlimited liability causes some issues there. Now, the profits are treated as regular income, so once again, no double taxation. It's even harder to transfer the ownership. Why? Yeah, everyone's got to agree. Now, let's get back to the fact that I'm 30 years older than her. I'm going to retire on July 31st, 2037. I think you guys already know that. Is that going to be good for you?
If you're going to fund my retirement, yeah.
No. Remember, I'm a scumbag, you're a scumbag, right? We're not going to do that. I don't, even if I had kids, I wouldn't even do that for them. Right? Now, what am I telling you here? Undoubtedly, I'm going to want out before she wants out. Now, if I'm going to sell, do you think she should have a say in who gets to buy that? Well, we better get that into the partnership agreement, right? Yeah, so it gets even harder to do. Because undoubtedly, if it's in the partnership agreement, and I bring people in, and I say, well, hey, what about Ms. Wynn? And you're like, eh. And I say, well, hey, what about Ms. Clarita? And you go, eh. Do you see how hard it is for me to try to sell my piece of this partnership? Does that make sense? Okay. So it's even harder to transfer ownership. There is no perpetual succession, and it's even worse than the sole proprietorship. Why is that? We got 4 partners. One of them smokes like a chimney and drinks like a fish and likes to go golfing in Branson. This is my neighbor, by the way. He likes to go golfing in Branson and driving back home drunk at like 11:30 in the morning. And the rest of us are all health nuts, right? What's going to happen? He's going to die, right? He hasn't yet. It's hard to kill crazy. Okay, now, when he dies, guess what? That's the end of the partnership. We have to form a new legal entity, right? When the one partner dies. Now, I want to mention this before I forget. There are some things called limited partnerships, and they'll have both a general partner and limited partners. The limited partners have limited liability. The general partner has unlimited liability. Now, knowing what you know about risk and reward, who has to get a bigger cut of the action? The general or the limited partners? Yeah, the general has to get a bigger cut because they're taking a bigger risk. Now, is it easy to raise capital? No, but it's easier than for the sole proprietor for a couple of reasons. Number one, now it's both of our wealth that can be used as the equity of the firm. And the other thing is this. If I'm a sole proprietor and I get hit by a bus, who makes the payments? Nobody. If I'm a partner and I get hit by a bus, who do they expect will try to continue to make the payments? Yeah, the partner, right? They're expecting the partner to go ahead and make those payments. And so there are a couple of reasons why it's easier to get financing. Number one, we've got more wealth combined, so we've got more equity to put into the firm. And number two, people are more willing to loan us money because we are less of a risk because we don't have all of our eggs in one basket as far as who's going to pay the bill. Now, is it easy to start a partnership? Now, by the way, 1 is the easiest, 4 is the hardest. Partnership is a little harder than with the sole proprietorship for one simple reason. We have to have a partnership agreement because if we don't, then that's where scumbaggery takes over and you end up with a bad situation. I'll give you an example. I had a friend, Cesar, in Colombia, and he was really bright and knew a lot about the restaurant industry. He wanted to open his own restaurant. He didn't have money, though. But he had an uncle, by the way, Spanish uncle is Tio, so everyone just called this guy Tio. Like, Tio sold his house in California, and of course that made him rich in Missouri terms. And then he basically put the money in, and he was supposed to work 40 hours a week at the restaurant, and Cesar was going to be the general manager, and he was going to be putting in, basically he's doing everything else, right? Okay, now, the agreement was 50-50, but it's just a verbal agreement, right? And the part about him working 40 hours a week was apparently a verbal agreement too, because what did Tio do most of the time? He just sat around in the restaurant and drank margaritas. I don't recall seeing the man sober, right? Now, when it came time to open restaurant number 2, by the way, restaurant number 1 was wildly successful because Cesar was working his butt off. When it came time to do restaurant number 2, do you think that they did a partnership agreement? Oh, hell yes. Everything was in writing. And by the way, Cesar says, hey, Tio, I know how this game is played now. I want 60, you get 40. What do you think Tio said?
No.
Actually, wouldn't you rather have 40% of something than 0% of nothing, right? So Tio's like, hell yeah, because he was still going to sit at the other restaurant and drink margaritas, right? Does that make sense? Okay, people are scumbags, even the family. Okay, so now, if we're going to do a partnership agreement, it has to be written down. Who do you think we should get involved? I got to get a lawyer. By the way, I think one of you may want to be a lawyer. Raise your hand. Nobody wants to confess to wanting to be a lawyer. Okay. Okay, so reason people typically decide to become lawyers is they want money, but they don't know how to do math. And so law is the way to go. I said this to a lawyer friend one time. He said, hell yeah. He said, the only math that I can do is to tell you 1/3 of any number. Why do you think he could tell me 1/3 of any number? That's what his cut was, right? He's good to this day. He's in his 80s now, and I can ask him, and he can give me 1/3 of any number. Okay, we're going to get the lawyers involved. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be painful. And so that's why the partnership is a little bit more difficult to start than the sole proprietorship. And then we've got the limited liability company. You may hear it as LLC. If you are from other parts of the world, you may see comma limited. I think in India they do comma limited. You may also see comma LTD period. It means the same thing. And it's all this identical thing that we're talking about here, the limited liability company. And here's how I want you to think about LLC. This is, by the way, I'm a crappy artist, but this is a cake. You guys can hopefully recognize that as a cake. Now, this cake is either a sole proprietorship or it is a partnership. How can I get this to be an LLC? Well, I am going to put some icing on this cake. I know that's crappy looking icing, but I'm going to put the LLC icing on whatever this cake is, and it ceases then to be a sole proprietorship and becomes an LLC, or it ceases to become a partnership and it becomes an LLC. Does that make sense? Now, that means you can take any sole proprietorship and turn it into an LLC. You say, well, wait a minute, where do I get this special magical icing? It's really amazingly easy. I've got my own LLC. My wife has hers. Do we do anything with them? We start little businesses and then we get bored and we stop, right? So my business is dead. I used to would have told you about my business, but no more, it's dead. Okay, now, but I still get this LLC. And if I decided today that I was gonna start making, like boots for cats or something, it would be under that LLC, just in case I got sued by all the vicious cat owners, right? Okay, now, how did I do that? Well, it turns out you can go to the Secretary of State's website for your state. In fact, you don't even have to do it in your own state. You can do it in someone else's state. But, I'm a Missourian, and I just go to the Missouri Secretary of State there, and I fill in a form. And here's what I had to have in order to get an LLC. Number one, a credit card with a limit of at least $50, because I've got to spend $50 to do this. Number two, I had to have an email address. Number three, I had to have a physical address. Folks, that's it. That's all you need in order to get this LLC. So I'm telling you, if you ever decide to start a business, don't get so excited that you go out there and become a sole proprietor. Get your LLC. In fact, what I would tell you is go home today, form your LLC, and just keep it in your hip pocket until the day you're ready to start your own business. And then you're like, wow, I bet I could make a bunch of money by making these little glittery shoes for ladies to wear to Taylor Swift concerts. And then you're getting ready to jump into it, and then you're filling in the paperwork to get started, and it says, what's the company name? You're like, it's my LLC, right? By the way, I assume that the Taylor Swift people would be just as vicious as the cat people. If someone breaks an ankle in your sparkly shoes, whoop, they're gonna sue you, right? Okay. That's the limited liability company. So basically, if there's only one owner, everything is just like a sole proprietorship, except for the limited liability. If it's more than one person, everything's just like a partnership, except for the unlimited liability. So that's your LLC. Is it easy to start? It actually is. And in fact, I would say it's easier to do an LLC for a sole proprietorship than to do a partnership without an LLC, right? Because that partnership agreement is the big thing. LLC is relatively minor comparatively. Now, so far, we have not seen anybody that has double taxation. And we know people would like to avoid that if they can. And we also see that the control of these legal entities are concentrated among just a few individuals. Let's talk about what then the corporation is. First of all, the corporation has limited liability. But I've already told you there's an easy way to do that, right? So you don't become a corporation for just limited liability. Also, corporations have double taxation. Double taxation ends up being a bigger tax than the personal rate because you're doing both corporate and dividend tax. And so you would like to avoid that if you can. So far, it's not looking all that great to be a corporation. However, we see our first benefit in easy ownership transfer. I am so angry at General Electric right now because they have taken a once great company and turned it into the corporate equivalent of an outdoor toilet. What can I do? How can I get out of my ownership position with GE? Sell my stock. The longest it's going to take is for me to remember my password for my account, right? That's it. Now, what about when you own a business and you have to go door to door trying to sell the darn thing? Do you see it's much easier to just sell stock? So that's the first benefit. And then we do have perpetual succession. In theory, corporations can live forever. In fact, I'll give you an example. And we don't even know what the oldest one out there is because the only time we hear about them is when they die. And so the one that I want to tell you about is Barings Bank. It was a bank out of Scotland. And they had been around for 500 years. 500 years. And they would still be around if it wasn't for some trader, Trader, in a back office in Singapore that made a lousy bet that just totally wiped out the company. So there may be ones out there. In fact, I'm pretty sure if you look at some of these ancient European breweries that are still in business, like on the 17th generation or whatever, they probably go back over 1,000 years. In theory, a corporation can last forever. What are the two things that can kill off a corporation? Number one, bankruptcy, right? And number two is if everybody involved decides that we're just going to wind this thing down, right? And both of those things can happen. Okay, now, is it easy for a corporation to raise capital? Yes. Number one, let's talk about debt. What do you think happens? Do you guys know who Tim Cook is? Yeah, so let's say Tim Cook goes in to see the same banker that my student went to see. And Tim Cook says, I want to borrow some money. And what do you think the loan officer is going to say? Yeah, come on in, Mr. Cook. This is a no-smoking building, but would you like a cigar? How about some brandy while we discuss your business, right? Totally different outcome. Why? Because they've got a much bigger a company. They've been around much longer. They're a much better credit risk, right? So it's easier to raise money in the private market, but they can also issue bonds, which allows them to borrow in the public market. So they can go out and issue bonds to people like you and me who buy those bonds and hold on to them and collect the interest payments and then the face value. So they have these two sources of debt, public and private. And then they also have a source of equity that these other forms of business just don't have. Remember, the equity for all these other businesses came from the wealth of the owners, right? But the equity at the corporation can also come from outsiders by issuing shares. So when I switch from being an LLC to being a corporation, I go through a process called the initial public offering, IPO. I sell shares to people and that money comes in, and then we're able to use that in addition to the wealth of the original founders. Now, if I had to choose for a small company that was growing at, say, 3-4% per year, if I had to choose LLC versus corporation, which one would I choose? A small company growing at 3-4% per year, I'm going to choose the LLC because I don't want to be faced with the double taxation. I don't want to have to put out, oh, by the way, a lot more paperwork with a corporation, which is why it's the most difficult one to start up here. And in this one, it really does pay to shop around. Delaware is the most popular state for corporations. Unless you're a criminal, then it's Nevada. By the way, why do you think Nevada is popular with criminals? Oh, yeah, they're kind of shady to begin with, but they don't have what's called reciprocity with the IRS. If they learn something dirty about you, they don't share it with the feds. So when I see, oh yeah, look it up. So when I hear someone saying that they've got a Nevada corporation, I'm like, whoop, I'm not doing any business with you. You're obviously a scumbag. Okay, and a high order scumbag, right? Okay, what else we're going to say about corporate? Oh, so if it's just growing slowly, I'm going to do an LLC. Why in the world would I choose to be a corporation with all the crap that goes with it? Oh, by the way, also quarterly reporting to the government, right? There's all sorts of things you have to report as a corporation. Why would I do it? And the answer is, if the opportunity is so big that you cannot finance all the growth with your current wealth and whatever debt people are willing to loan to you. So let's give an example here, and I'm just making this stuff up. But let's say Mark Zuckerberg. You guys know who he is? Mark Zuckerberg and his roommate Frank start Facebook in their dorm at Harvard or whatever school they were at. And in the beginning, they're 50-50 partners. But then they figure out that people are really vapid and self-absorbed and that this thing is going to grow really, really fast. And so they're like borrowing money from family and friends. And then they get some venture capitalists involved, but it's still not enough. So what do? Eventually they do an IPO. Now in the beginning, Fred owned half and Mark owned half. So every time that the company made $1, Mark would get 50 cents and Fred would get 50 cents. Now after the IPO, Mark only has 25% and Fred only has 25%. Why in the world would they be willing to do that? And the answer has to do with pizza.
No,
What's that?
no. Because they want to earn return the interest. Like the money come back when they put the money on.
I think you're heading toward it. Okay, so you walk into the pizza shop, and what do they have? The low ones. What do they have nailed up on the wall? The different sizes, right? In the beginning, Mark and Fred own a small pizza, so they each have half of a small pizza. After the IPO, they own 25% of an extra large pizza. What is more pizza? Half of a small pizza or quarter of an extra large? It's quarter of the extra large. By the way, I was standing behind people at the pizza joint and they're ordering and they're like, how many pieces is that? And we could cut that thing into as many damn pieces as you want, right? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so the only reason for you to become a corporation is if it is a fast-growing business and you cannot finance it all yourself. And by the way, you're not just giving up money. What else are you giving up when you sell shares? Yeah, control, right? Control. I always want to make sure I keep 50% plus 1 so I can maintain control of the firm. So now, shifting gears one more time. What do we care about in finance? We care about cash flows. Now I've got a couple of accountants in here, as I recall. I've got a couple of accountants. And accountants love to talk about things like net income, right? Have you ever tried paying for groceries with net income? What do they expect you to pay with? Cash, right? And you can't pay your rent with accounts receivable? Like, yeah, my neighbor owes me $400, so there you go. It doesn't work that way, right? You got to have the cash. So we are concerned about cash flows. And we are concerned about identifying them. Typically, we're having to work our way backwards out of accounting stuff to figure out what the real cash flows were. And the other thing is we're concerned with the timing of cash flows. And we are concerned with timing of cash flows for 2 reasons. Number one, hopefully you guys still remember from Finance 380, the time value of money. $1 today is worth more than $1 a year from now, right? But there's another reason that we're concerned about timing. Let's say I've got a big bill coming due in 6 months. and a client is going to pay me in 7 months, I might be running out of cash by paying that bill at 6 months when this client owes me money a month on down the road. And so the timing is also important for figuring out the cash that you have on to pay the bills that you have. And we call that cash budgeting. I don't cover it in this class, but it's very definitely something to think about. One of the things that I do, so I pay all my bills every month, and then I sweep all but $500 into the savings account. And so then I only got $500 in the checking. If something comes up, so like my insurance the other day, they're like, well, do you want to pay this bill now, or do you want to pay it on the 11th of February when it's due? What do you think I said? Yeah, on the 11th of February, the money's the same, right? There's no discount. And why? Because I know I'm going to be having another paycheck before then. So I'm like, that's my cash budgeting. Okay. Now, could I withdraw the money out of savings and pay him? Sure I could. Do I want to? Heck no, I'm making 4.35% on that money. Okay. Now let's talk, we've got 4 minutes here. Let's talk about the goal of financial management. We're not going to get all the way through here today, but we will get started. Number 1, do you think we should be trying to beat the competition and maximize our sales or market share?
Market share.
Yeah, market share. People think, yeah, that's great, market share. Is your background marketing? Okay, usually marketing people are the first ones to jump on market share. And in fact, I can recall when I worked in business and the marketing people at the water coolers giving each other high fives because of where our market share was at. Now, is that the goal? The answer is no. And here's why. You can absolutely destroy a business by going after market share. I'll give an example. General Motors. General Motors back in the 60s and 70s was a big deal, and the United States, by the way, was the world's biggest auto producer because we were the only people to have factories standing after World War II, right? So these guys had kind of a head start. Now, in the 70s, we have these Arab oil embargoes, we have a couple of oil crises, and people start saying, wow, I don't know that I need a 455 V8 to be able to get to work. And so they wanted something more fuel efficient. And so they started buying these little Japanese cars. And these little Japanese cars, turns out, were actually not only more fuel efficient, they were also more reliable. Now, General Motors notices that their market share is starting to drop. Now, if you are in the situation of General Motors, what you should be doing is going and saying, okay, how are we going to compete with this new situation? And the answer is to build higher quality, more efficient cars. Do you think that's what General Motors did? Hell no. What are we going to do? We're going to lower the prices on the cars to try to get them to sell to maintain this market share. Now that sounds fine, except for one thing. What suffers when you lower the prices of the cars? Margin. Yeah, your margins, right? Your profit drops. And so, and they kept doing this trick year after year after year, trying to preserve market share, and they were only partially successful. But by the time General Motors went bankrupt, they were only making enough money on each car to pay for their retirees' health care. That was it. That was all they were. Are you asking a question or scratching an itch? He's scratching an itch, okay. Okay, now, you can absolutely destroy a company by seeking after market share in the wrong way. What about minimizing costs? No, you're saying no. What's the danger with minimizing cost?
The low quality of product.
Yeah, low quality of product. For example, there's a steakhouse here in town called Jim's. Are you guys eating there? Jim's, that's good stuff. Jim's serves beef, like from cows. But what if Jim's were to figure out that horse meat costs half as much? Hey, wow, we've reduced the cost of our meat by 50%. Woohoo! I go in there and I have my usual steak. And Jim comes by and says, how is it? And I said, it's a little tough, a little gamey. He says, that's because we've switched to horse meat. That's now filet mignon. Sorry. Okay. And now, I'm a polite guy. I'm like, oh, wow, okay. I'm gonna tip my waitress, I'm gonna pay my bill, but do you think I'm coming back? No, you can absolutely destroy a company doing that. And we'll talk about the rest of these next time.